I'm Dr. Pete Economo, the East Coast psychologist.
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin, the West Coast psychologist.
And this is When East
Meets West. Pete, so today we're going to talk about, not maybe the most comfortable emotion, but we're going to talk about anger today.
Why is it not comfortable?
Well, I mean, I don't know about you, but, it doesn't, I don't personally love feeling angry. I don't know. Maybe you do. I don't know. Some people get a little addicted to feeling angry, which we'll talk about, but I personally don't enjoy it.
No, I don't enjoy it either. And with the practice of mindfulness, I really don't feel it as much as I once did.
Right. Yes. It's more regulated, not quite as intense. It's more regulated.
Yeah.
Totally. Well, I think, we've done a lot of episodes on other emotions. And of course, when we've done these episodes, we always start with talking about the evolutionary function of emotions,
Yes.
because most people aren't that understandably aware of like why we feel things, like what's the point? Why does this exist?
Yes.
So if that's okay, can I maybe jump into some good old fashioned historical evolutionary?
Yes, bring the knowledge, Dr. Rubin.
Okay. So anger serves a purpose. So evolution did not select for it for no reason. So we've talked in the past how all emotions are hardwired with something called an action urge, which basically means what your emotion is telling you to do. So anger evolved to help us fight back when either ourselves or someone that we're cared about, or our human tribe was being attacked, right? So anger, basically what it does is it calls us to action, calls us to respond. So if we think about fight, flight, or freeze, this is the fight response, right?
Yes.
And that was really helpful because, again, if you were being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, you don't want to just necessarily stand still, right? You'd want to run, maybe you'd freeze, but you might want to fight back sometimes. And this is really important to understand because I want listeners to think about when we feel angry, we often feel like very powerful, right? Like it sort of creates this surge of energy. Even think physiologically, there's like an increase in heart rate, like we kind of tense up, we might flush. And this is where we'll get into some of the stickier points as well, but we can also feel very righteous about things, like we're right. I don't know, anything else you would add here?
Well, what do you think? Why do you think people get angry? Let's maybe simply some example of when you were angry, or
like in modern times,
in
not
modern
just
times today, right? Because I'm even thinking one thing for me is always like customer service, and I think especially during the pandemic, I realized that it seems as though customer service has shifted, whereby the customer's not necessarily always right anymore. Those days are gone.
maybe not such a terrible thing, but okay. Well, all right. So if we start the evolutionary piece of anger calls us to action when we're being threatened in some way, right? In modern experience, there's a whole spectrum of what that can mean, right? So we can feel angry. If anger's in the middle, if everyone imagine listening a spectrum here, the most intense would be rage, right? And the least intense would be a slight irritation or slight.
I just had a word affiliation. Can I bring that to you?
Yeah, sure, please.
Rage Against the Machine.
Great band.
Okay, go ahead. Move on to the spectrum.
Great band. Great 90s band.
Yeah. Spectrum. Sorry.
Yes, I love that. And so and frustration is somewhere in the middle between, say, anger and irritation or annoyance. So we feel angry when we feel that something has happened that's that's not right. That's not just, right? We feel angry if, again, something awful has happened, like we've been harmed in some way, or someone we love has been harmed. Anything else you would add here?
Well, I'm going to give you an APA definition, maybe. How's that?
Oh, okay. How did I not expect that? I don't know why.
I know, well, because it's been a minute since we recorded. So it's an emotion characterized by antagonism towards someone or something you feel has deliberately done you wrong, which is exactly what you just described.
Yeah, exactly.
And it could be good, and it just motivates you to find solutions to problems.
Exactly. Well, so that piece is really important. So it's saying when we feel angry, again, it calls us to action. It calls us to do something. And that's very effective, right? So I don't know about you, but I work with a lot of people that they don't let themselves feel angry. It's kind of like that gets judged as something, bad, quote unquote, or negative. Like, and I'll say anger is oftentimes justified. Like, I mean, I don't know if you've had this experience clinically, Pete, but sometimes, like when I'm working with people that have experienced trauma, there is understandably a hard time accessing anger initially, because of course the fear dominates, right?
So interestingly, I'll say that with my clients, tend to be these like, really high,
like the athletes.
The athletes.
Yeah.
They access anger too often.
Well, it's total. Well, I work with those folks too, but I work with those folks, but say more about that.
So their trauma brain would likely actually access anger more because it's sort of the default. And so there's research that supports that neurologically sort of their fight, flight, or freeze went right to anger because that's what protected them, or at least that's the understanding in which that we would have as to why they go there so quickly, but that we would see that they go there quickly.
Well, and I think we could even, this is where we get into the nuance of, biology interacts with learning history and experience. Is like sometimes there may be some like gendered learning experiences in terms of emotional expression, right? So, I mean, I know you work with athletes of all genders, but I'm wondering if mostly men, right? And I don't know, will you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess socially it's more accepted. And so for men to be angry, whereas a woman, like, so, Nick, if you and I were to get a fight one day while we're on air, you'd be seen as, the B word, and I would be seen as strong, for assertive or something.
Right. Well, when I'm thinking of our masculinity episode of toxic masculinity, we talked a lot about this, right?
We did. Yep. And so also, though, there is another area of research that finds that sometimes men express anger as a result of depression or sadness. And so that's like the phenotype is the anger, but underlying that is really sadness.
I love that you just said phenotype. It's one of my favorite genotypes and phenotypes. Love that. And I think like genetics, yes, same. So yes. And I think just even more broadly, outside of sort of the context of gender, I think most people can think about times when they've not wanted to feel sadness and they'll sort of feel angry instead. And that is something I talk about with all kinds of patients. It's like, because again, anger makes us feel powerful. It also like distances us from something, right? Where sadness, like think about like when you, like when you're grieving, right? Like sometimes, part of the process is being angry, which is normal, right? But anger does feel better than feeling sad because it's like, it feels as though, like you can do something. There's like a fighting reality quality, right?
Is there an anger character on Inside Out, that movie?
There is an anger character.
Okay.
Yeah, there is.
They're testing us.
Yeah. No, there is an anger character. Great movie if no one's watched it yet. A great movie. So a lot of times people will go to anger over sadness or even other unpleasant sort of like downregulated emotions like shame or guilt. That's another one I've seen before, right? When someone's done something, maybe that they feel guilty about, right? Like appropriately guilty, they'll sort of turn it around and be angry at the person that's, sort of calling them out for that. Why? Because it's like, you don't have to sit with the guilt. You don't have to, contact that pain, right? But I also see, like I said, people that have a hard time accessing anger, right? They don't allow themselves to feel that way.
Why do you think that is?
Well, because again, I think if I'm speaking about trauma, sometimes it's that the anxiety, fear has dominated, right? So it's like that there's sort of like no space for the anger until the fear response has been effectively processed, right? Then there's space to be angry about it. But I also think that, again, if we go back to sort of like contextual factors, and we could talk about women, for example, are often like kind of taught like it's not okay, you're not okay to be angry, right? Or that's, or I don't know, I hear things a lot of times like, oh, I shouldn't be angry about this, like as if it says something negative about one's character or something like that.
Well, that's a good old cognitive distortion anyway.
It's a good
should statement there.
Yeah. Well, Pete, I'm wondering, like, what does Zen Buddhism say about anger specifically, if it does? I mean, I
There's
have
lots
some
of it.
guesses. Oh, there is. Okay, so very curious.
Yeah, there's lots of it, and I know that you always like put me on the spot for some of this stuff.
Well, because I want to know. I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, it's purposeful. It's a natural order of suffering. Obviously the goal is to get away from it. So what I opened up saying earlier, or as we began this episode, is I do feel it less. And so I think with the practice of meditation and mindfulness, while I can regulate it more effectively, no doubt, I also experience it less frequently, because when I'm connected with peace more regularly, the other emotions, and that's honestly why sometimes high performers don't like mindfulness or meditation, because it almost feels like it's too level. Like there are less ups and downs.
Yep.
And that's really supported in the research to say that, well, as my brain changes, there will be less ups and downs. All the other aspects of behaviorally, like, okay, I'm not judging my emotions, I'm regulating them more effectively. And then over time, like say, for example, some of the anxiety, we don't do this in third wave CBT, but one of the things I'll say is like, we're not saying we're going to eliminate your anxiety or anger. However, as you practice, you'll likely notice that there's a steady decline of your experience or understanding. And so Buddhism would kind of be similar in that way, where they're saying, allow anger to arise and then find some antidotes to prevent it, because anger itself is going to hijack people's, current state or the actual present moment. And so, the antidote, one of them in particular, like Pema Chodron writes a lot about, she'll say patience, and so that you really, and then sometimes, and you and I talk a lot in here about interpretation. So what anger actually is in like Sanskrit or some other, languages that this has all been written in, but often they'll use that as like aggression synonymously. So that'd be interesting for you to break down, because I think, I think in the West, we would think anger as the emotion, aggression as the behavior.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's 100% what I would say. And well, because even like, if you go back to what Pema Chodron says, like patience is a behavior, practicing patience, right? And so that makes total sense to me. When we practice patience, that would help regulate anger, because it's like slowing down, right? It's not fighting back against everything, right?
Right.
But I think maybe, Pete, it's important to distinguish between, how do I want to say this? Like, regulating anger overall, which is, I think, what you're speaking to, which is, when you practice, any kind of, use any kind of mindful approach, like you're going to feel anger less intensely and less frequently. Right. And I think that's because it's like the day-to-day things don't grab us as much. So if we go back to that spectrum idea, right? Like things that are annoy us or irritate us or, hurt our feelings. Maybe those things, don't get in as much, like they don't sort of like puncture us in the same kind of way. And so what I then have personally experienced and how I understand it is like, okay, so then you're not feeling anger as often or as consistently or as intensely, though that doesn't mean that you're not going to experience anger when, for example, you're being attacked or a loved one has been really hurt. It's like feeling anger maybe when it's more justified is kind of how I approach it, like as opposed to having it show up like for less I don't know what the word, like, well, sometimes they're justified, but like less justified reasons, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and that would seem to me to think about like the spectrum, like you're saying. And so it's like but because Buddhism is really rooted in peace.
Yes.
Like, if I'm attacked, there's still meant to be peace as a response. Like it's not an aggressive. So it's a really
right. Sure. Yeah.
Now that's in theory. That we know there's parts of the world right now that Buddhist practitioners are attacking, other religious practices. So it's not, because humans, as we've said before, like kind of screw everything up.
Right. Right. Buddhism was and other Eastern practices, their practices created by human beings, and so nobody's infallible to the downsides of the human brain and the human condition.
Correct. Yep. So there is, I mean, maybe I'll read. So there's from Dhammapada. So again, like I study mostly like third wave, the third, well, obviously third wave CBT, but within the Zen world, like Japanese based sort of traditions. This is a little bit more Indian based, but there are the idea that how anger is really clouding and causing suffering. So the belief there is that it's detrimental. So they'll say something like, so here's like just a saying for you all. So beware of bodily anger and control thy body. Leave the sins of the body and with thy body practice virtue. Beware of anger of the tongue and control thy tongue. Leave the sins of the tongue and practice virtue with thy tongue. Beware of the anger of the mind and control thy mind. Leave the sins of the mind and practice virtue with thy mind. The wise who control their body, who control their tongue, the wise who control their mind are indeed well controlled. So this was verses 231 to 34, where you're like, so again, I don't like the word control. Remember that.
Right. I do. Of course I do.
But what they're saying is like, understand that, what you're saying is involved, your body is involved,
sure,
the emotions involved, and then ultimately how do you control your behavior?
Totally. And I think, as you're reading that, and again, going back to what you said a moment ago about translation, it's like, this is where, I think, as, we live in obviously the United States and the Western world, we're native English speakers, right? Like, we have to be careful in how we interpret what's being said, because I also have the experience a lot of times where people take Zen Buddhist concepts and use them as experiential avoidance, right? They use them to say, which, for listeners, if you've heard us talk about this before. So experiential avoidance is the behavioral practice of trying to fix, control, get rid of, problem solve, ignore, suppress any internal stimuli. And that includes memories, thoughts, physical sensations, emotions, or urges. And this is a thing humans do because of our, language using brains. And so a lot of times, like, for example, we talk about anger, which we're saying this is built into our bodies and our brains. And it's not just humans, right? Other animals also feel anger, right? So it's coded in us biologically. And I, my understanding, again, in these, I'm no expert here, but my understanding and experience of mindfulness practices around that is like, yes, we're trying not to get dysregulated in anger. We're trying not to lash out, right? We're trying to keep it regulated. And as best we can is to practice compassion towards ourselves and others. However, I think a lot of people would hear that and say, see, I shouldn't be angry.
Right.
And they kind of use that as a way to disconnect and distance themselves. Right.
Yeah.
It's like an intellectualization of emotion. And that's something I encounter it quite a bit, not just with anger, with other emotions too. And so that's, I would be curious, what some of the Zen teachers would say if somebody was sort of like going to that intellectual place about it.
Well, it is often, so there are some teachers even within my, teachers lineage that would really separate Western behaviorism or any kind of psychotherapy from some of the teachings. And I think I can't, like,
well, of course
I can't.
They're both part of you. That's why you can't,
it's funny because one of the teachers in particular mentions that a lot in her talks, and I'm just like, I can't. But there was another writing of 8 tips before we end, because I think some tips would be helpful. But my mom is very knowledgeable, but so she would say life sucks and then you die. But that actually is samsara, which just says that life is unsatisfactory, and so that's part of anger. Patience, again, like we mentioned from Pema Chodron and other, analyze the situation, meditation. And again, meditation and learning from your enemy. So what we're also asked to do in any kind of feelings of aggression or anger is to sit with it. That's a lot of the Zen way, is just to sit and see what comes up and watch it come up. It's not push it away, watch it come up.
Well, and we got to be really mindful about this, which listeners, that doesn't mean wallow in it. Because in anger, what happens in anger is we have the urge to ruminate, which means it's to go over in your mind over and over again. Rumination intensifies emotion. So we always, from a third wave CBT perspective, will say, walk away from what makes you feel angry, but that includes in your mind as well. Right. So don't remove yourself from the situation and then think about how you've been wronged over and over again. Like that's going to grow that anger to a much larger, stickier place. place.
And that's what meditation teaches you not to do.
That's right. That's right.
And so as you sitting with it doesn't mean ruminate. Sitting with it means see what comes up, and then you move on to the next moment. Because everything is impermanent. This is a sort of thing to think about. So that will go around. And then the last two things is think about karma and emptiness. So karma is that how are you responding, because that translates into your next life. And then emptiness, that really anything you're responding to is empty, that it doesn't actually exist. And that's where it gets a little bit more philosophical. But, sometimes we like chant the mantra of emptiness just to remind ourselves that this does not exist and it's not who we are.
Always difficult to end on a concept like that.
Why?
But yes, thank you. Thank you, Pete. I always learn so much hearing from you. So, listeners, I hope this was a helpful introduction to just understanding anger a little bit better, understanding that it is a part of us. It's in our biological code, and it's something that we don't have to let it dominate and rule our lives. So, go ahead, practice some of these suggestions and let us know how it goes. This has been When East Meets West. I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin.
And I'm Dr. Pete Economo. Be present, be brave. This has been When East Meets West. All material is based on opinion and educational training of Drs. Pete Economo and Nikki Rubin.
Content is for informational and educational purposes only.